So a few months ago, I tried to raise some money for a music project by selling my car and replacing it with an old Buick LeSabre I bought from my grandmother, which only has a working cassette player. And so for my car music, I've had to scrounge up cassettes wherever I can find them for cheap at Goodwills and flea markets. And I happened to find this cassette of Ozzy Osbourne's The Ultimate Sin, even though it's in the case for Bark at the Moon. And I do, as an aside, love the kind of crappy, low-rent quality of cassettes, right? They're the ugliest and the worst sounding and the least reliable, but currently the cheapest of all the music physical formats, right? They're the ugly little misfits of the music collecting world. They're very dear to my heart. But this video isn't about cassettes, and I can't imagine that any of my normal audience has any particularly strong opinions about Bark at the Moon or The Ultimate Sin. What I'm going to be talking about instead is how the role of music has shifted in popular culture in a particular way that this made me think of that I think ultimately has had a devaluing effect. Now, this particular Ozzy cassette jogged the memory of being 11 years old and buying another Ozzy album, No More Tears, on cassette at Kmart. I don't have that cassette available to show you because my mom got very offended by the song Mr. Tinkertrain, which is written from the perspective of a child molester.
Would you like some sweeties, little girl? Come a little closer.
And made me take it back to the store and trade it for an Aerosmith tape. With 30 years of hindsight, I do now think that the child molester in the song is probably a metaphor for the way that rock musicians, particularly in the 80s, were perceived as a corrupting influence on the young, particularly Ozzy himself, right? And that what he's doing there is equating the rock star with the child molester as a way of kind of satirizing that panicked overreaction to his music and persona. So, of course, by responding the way that she did, my mom was actually demonstrating the thematic idea of the song, which does have a certain kind of appropriateness. Maybe if I'd been smart enough to say all that as an 11-year-old, she'd have let me keep the Ozzy tape. But I didn't, and you know what that led to was the chronic worry for several years after that she might get upset about music I liked, make me return it to the store. When I got the Genesis album Trespass, I made sure neither of my parents heard the song The Knife, which is, of course, an incitement to violent revolution with some fairly graphic lines.
I'll give you the names of those who must kill all, must die with their children, carry the heads to the palace of old, hang them high, let the blood flow now.
And while the song is about the idea that violence actually presents an illusory path to freedom, once again, I didn't understand that point well enough to explain it. When I started getting into heavier music, this became much more complicated in the pre-streaming days when you had to obtain things in secret and hide them once you'd got them. Now, I really didn't have particularly sensitive or uptight or conservative parents on the whole, but, you know, in those days, I think everybody's parents were at least a little bit offended by something, right? This copy of Slayer's Rain in Blood was given to me by a teacher in high school when I was a sophomore. I had mentioned to him at some point that I was interested in Slayer, and he pulled me into an empty classroom, handed me this CD, told me it was mine to keep as long as I swore to never tell anyone where I got it. I bought Marilyn Manson's Portrait of an American Family on a trip with my grandmother and some cousins. We all went to the mall. I snuck off to Sam Goody and bought this, and probably something else at the same time, you know, to have kind of a cover story about what I was getting. I had a Game Boy carrying case where you could take the plastic tray out of the fabric, put a CD under it. So, you know, I put it in that little hiding spot until I could get it home, slip it under the bed. That episode felt particularly resourceful and triumphant. You know, it felt a bit like smuggling samizdat in Soviet Russia. I was quite disappointed when I then listened to the album and it kind of sucked. Of course, once I got my driver's license, most of this subterfuge went out the window, but I've realized that there's a curious nostalgia attached to having to make an effort to sneak music, right? To being incredibly curious about a particular artist or album, but having no way to satisfy that curiosity because some authority figure refuses to allow you to do so. It's something most kids today I don't think will experience for a lot of different reasons. First, In the streaming era, it's much harder for parents to regulate what a kid hears, right? If you're 11 and for whatever perverse reason you want to hear Mr. Tinkertrain, there are lots of ways that you might do it. There's not really any effective way for your parents to convincingly Aussie-proof the house. And second, I didn't really want to hear Mr. Tinkertrain. What I wanted to hear was the title cut from No More Tears, which is the closest to prog rock that Ozzy really ever got in a solo context. But that song, of course, became Forbidden Fruit because it just happened to be on the same album as a song about child molestation. But now, there's no structural reason that a kid who was interested in the song No More Tears would even have to listen to the album. But third, it's kind of hard to imagine most parents now caring enough to bother, right? The fear that kids will be meaningfully corrupted by Ozzy Osbourne or Eminem or whoever else seems almost heartbreakingly quaint now for a very long list of reasons that I won't begin to articulate here, some of which I think you could probably view as positive, some of which not so much. But I do find myself missing it, perversely or not. I've tried in other videos to articulate what bothers me about Spotify in particular and the streaming era in general, and I think a lot of my reasons really come down to the psychological effect of the elimination of scarcity, right? And how that changes the perception of value. The need to fight authority figures to experience music is one thing that creates a sense of scarcity, just like not being able to afford all the albums you want to hear, or being interested in something that's out of print. There's a certain set of albums that I wanted for months or years desperately before I was finally able to find some way to sneak them past my parents' watchful gaze. And, the excitement of finally beating that restriction and hearing that music still colors the way that I think about things like, I don't know, Nothing's Shocking by Jane's Addiction, even decades later. Obviously, it's nice to have all the music in the world available from an infinite pump. It's nice enough that I've never really felt much need to do both sides' concessions or counter-arguments when I talk about this kind of stuff, right? Because the entire world is doing that for me. I don't have to bother. But it does produce a flattening effect, right? Where everything is the same as everything else. And one aspect of that flattening, I think, is the removal of the concept of the forbidden in relationship to music. And, in a world where the cultural position of music is perhaps slipping, where kids are less interested in music, less concerned with it, less preoccupied with it than kids were in our day, I think that one part of that flattening is the loss of some of the subjective value of music that comes with the idea of it being something forbidden. Hope that all makes sense. Sorry I didn't talk about any prog rock today. Be sure to check out Electric Brain Electric Shadow on Bandcamp, your favorite streaming service, or via the playlist link in the description for this video. And I'll see everybody in a week.